Section 8 of From the Latchkey of My Bookhouse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. From the Latchkey of My Bookhouse, edited by Olive Beaupre Miller. Bryant, William Cullen. American, 1794 through 1878. One of the descendants of that arch little Puritan maid, Priscilla Mullins, and her bashful lover, John Alden, was a small boy named William Cullen Bryant. William was born in the beautiful hilly country of Cummington, Massachusetts, fit cradle for a real poet of nature. His father, Dr. Peter Bryant, was a country physician, and he used to love to wander with his sons out in the wild woodlands and up into the hills, keen-eyed and alert to each flash of little woodland creatures through the leaves, loving them all and lifting up his heart with joy for all nature's ways of beauty. Dr. Bryant was a lover of the English poets, too, and he used sometimes to write verses of his own. In the long winter nights, when the snow lay white on the world without, and a roaring fire blazed on the cozy hearth within, he would often read aloud to his children from the treasures of his library, which was one of the largest in the neighborhood. During the day the boys went to the public school, but when the school hours were over, they raced out into the woods and fields, exploring all the country round about. It was their habit, too, on these delightful rambles, to recite aloud to the audience of tall trees, scurrying rabbits, or even stones, the verses which they had been reading at home. Cullen particularly delighted in this happy custom, and often on his walks he composed and recited little poems of his own. One of these early verses he delivered in his schoolroom in his 11th year, and it was afterwards published in the county newspaper, the Hampshire Gazette. The subject chosen for his poem by this ambitious youngster of 11 was, "The Advance of Knowledge." When Cullen grew to young manhood, he was sent to Williams College, but his father was too poor to permit him to finish his education at Yale University, as he had hoped, and so for a time he pursued his studies at home. It was at this period, when he was still little more than a youth, that, as he was one day wandering in the tangled depth of the rich primeval forest, his meditations framed themselves into the beautiful poem Thanatopsis. To him who in the love of nature holds communion with her visible forms, she speaks a various language. For his gayer hours she has a voice of gladness, and a smile and eloquence of beauty, and she glides into his darker musings with a mild and healing sympathy that steals away their sharpness ere he is aware. Having written the poem down on paper, he laid it aside and appears to have forgotten it altogether. It was not until some 6 years later that his father accidentally discovered it, took it to Boston, and had it published. It produced a decided impression at once, for no American poet had yet written anything to equal it. From this time forth, though Cullen had been educated for a lawyer, he continued to devote himself to literature. In 1825 he became editor-in-chief and part proprietor of the New York Evening Post, a position which he held for 50 years. During all that time, by means of his articles in the Post, he helped to direct the current of national thought into the wisest and best channels. These important articles he had a habit of scribbling down on old envelopes and scraps of waste paper, of which he always hoarded a generous store. The sincerity and earnestness with which he presented his principles, and his quick native sense of justice, as well as his complete independence of all managing politicians, soon made of his paper a great power in the land. When the question of abolition of slavery began to be agitated, Bryant in the Post took the side of the abolitionists. This stand was decidedly unpopular in those days, and brought down upon it a storm of abuse. The Post then began to lose favor with the public, and it was only by the most persistent struggles that Bryant kept it alive against the tense and growing prejudices of the community. Mr. Bryant, however, refused to surrender a single one of his convictions, although he was denounced and deserted by many of his former friends, and was more than once threatened by the violence of the mob. In 1860 he was one of the presidential electors who chose President Lincoln, and ever afterward he enjoyed the confidence and friendship of Lincoln. During the dark days of the Civil War, when all too many deserted and betrayed that gaunt, lone figure in the president's chair, Bryant stood firmly by him, ever aiding and supporting him, and no other journal was more instrumental than the Post in bringing about the great changes of public opinion which ended in the destruction of slavery. Thus, the middle years of Bryant's life were too busy with hard work to leave much time for poetry. But when the years of national storm and stress had ended, he undertook his most ambitious literary work, translations of the Odyssey and the Iliad. Mr. Bryant lived to be a very old man. He was the first American poet to win permanent distinction, and he exercised a mighty influence over the younger literary men of America. Important works: Thanatopsis, The Fountain, To a Waterfowl. Burgess, Gelett. American, 1868 through blank. Gelett Burgess was born in Boston. He was a draughtsman and instructor in topographical drawing at the University of California, but he is known chiefly as the author and illustrator of several whimsical books for children. Important works: The Lively City o' Ligg, Goops and How to Be Them. Burgess, Thornton. American, 1874 through blank. Thornton Burgess was born in Sandwich, Massachusetts, and spent all his boyhood in the fields, the woods, and marshes around this Cape Cod town. Here he hunted, fished, and made acquaintance with all the animals and birds. For some time he wrote nature articles for various magazines under the name W. B. Thornton, but in all his spare moments he was out of doors, walking or boating, and studying wildlife. At length he was made one of the editors of Good Housekeeping, and it was in that magazine that he first won his name as a storyteller for children. His fascinating tales were first told to his own children, and for all that Peter Rabbit, Reddy Fox, and all the rest frisk through his stories in little coats and vests, trousers and hats, their habits are nevertheless as accurately true to the life of each animal as though his books were scientific nature studies. Important works: The Adventures of Peter Cottontail, The Burgess Bird Book. Burns, Robert. Scotch, 1759 through 1796. In a tiny one-room mud cottage near the village of Ayr, in Scotland, was born little Robert Burns. The boy's good father had built the hut with his very own hands, but its walls were so frail that only a week after the little fellow's birth, when there came up a violent gale, the house was blown into ruins. In the dead of night, mother and child were carried to a neighbor's dwelling for shelter. A sturdy farmer was Mr. Burns, and he meant his children to have an education. Accordingly, he and 4 of his neighbors hired John Murdoch to keep a school for their bairns, and this kindly Scotsman lived in turn for a few weeks at a time with each of the different families. Little Robert, it is true, liked to play truant. He loved each "wee, modest, crimson-tipped flower," each "cow'rin, timorous beastie" of the field, and the "sweet warbling woodlark on the tender spray," far better than his lessons. He loved, too, the "wild mossy mountains," where grouse led their coveys through the heather, and shepherds piped while they tended their sheep. Nevertheless, with infinite patience, Murdoch overcame the boy's truancy and won him to his studies. Now there was at this time in the Burns household an old woman named Betty Davidson, who knew more tales than anyone else in the country concerning fairies, ghosts, and devils. In the eerie dusk of the cottage firelight, Robert sat at old Betty's knee and soaked in stories of witches and warlocks, of wrinkled beldames and withered hags, which were later to make a riot of fun through his poem of Tam O'Shanter. His mother, too, taught him the early romances and history of Scotland, arousing in his breast the deepest tenderness for his country. Many a time the little fellow was to be seen strutting down the village street in the wake of the drums and the squealing bagpipes. Later, while he followed the plough through the fresh-turned fields, he always had a book of ballads held up before him, and when the village blacksmith gave him a life of William Wallace to read, off he must go on the very first fine summer's day to explore every den and dell in Leghland woods where Wallace was said to have hidden. When Robert was 15 years old, he worked once in the golden glowing harvest field by the side of a lassie who sang like a bird for sweetness. The sight and sound awoke in his heart the gift of song, and called forth from him his first poem. A sturdy, tender, affectionate lad was Robert Burns, but when he grew to be a youth he was sent to the country dancing school, and there he fell in with evil companions. Later, too, he met certain smugglers who plied their trade in the deep hidden caves of the bare and rocky Ayrshire coast, and was attracted by their lawless ways and speech. He began to frequent the taverns, to drink and join in many a riotous revel, and so the poor lad's life could go but from bad to worse. His father died, leaving a burden of debts, the farm was poor, crops failed, and Robert found himself, at last, tangled and fast bound in a host of difficulties. The only way out seemed to be for him to leave his country for far off Jamaica. In order to raise the passage money of £9 to take him to Jamaica, friends urged Burns to publish the poems which he had so long been writing. And thus appeared his first volume of verse. It was instantly praised, and Burns at once became popular. Instead of going to Jamaica, he went to Edinburgh. From the little farm in Ayrshire, he made his way to the fine old city which towered up proudly before him from Holyrood to the castle, picturesque and smoke-wreathed by day, by night a climbing tier of lights and cressets. In Edinburgh he suddenly found himself a lion, feted and praised by all. But alas! Success in the city was short-lived. Burns recognized very shortly that he was wholly out of sympathy with the standards of the world. His downright honesty could not endure the bow and scrape before men of high rank who had no abilities whatsoever. How could he, whose heart was yearning to pay honor to whom honor was due, endure to meet at a great man's table, Squire somebody or something, and see a fellow whose abilities would scarcely have made an eightpenny tailor, and whose heart was not worth 3 farthings, meet with all the fawning notice and attention which were withheld from a man of genius, merely because he was poor? This was a state of affairs never to be endured by the man who could write thus, quote, "Is there for honest poverty that hangs his head and all that? The coward slave, we pass him by. We dare be poor for all that. For all that, and all that, our toils obscure and all that. The rank is but the guinea stamp, the man's the gold for all that. What though on homely fare we dine, wear hodden grey and all that? Give fools their silks and knaves their wine. A man's a man for all that. For all that, and all that. Their tinsel show, and all that. The honest man, though e'er so poor, is king o' men for all that. You see yon birkie called a lord, who struts and stares, and all that? Though hundreds worship at his word, he's but a coof for all that. For all that, and all that, his ribboned staff, and all that. The man of independent mind, he looks and laughs at all that." End quote. The very heyday of his success in Edinburgh, Burns began to see that he should have to return to the country, don his hodden grey once again, and follow the plough. Accordingly, he turned his back on the city and married a country girl. Then he settled down to a small farm at Ellisland, with high hopes that here he should be happy. But poor Burns! In spite of his warm heart and love of laughter, he was too weak and yielded too easily to temptation ever to be happy. The taverns and alehouses saw him far too frequently again. How then could he make Ellisland pay? In a short time he had to sell it. With his wife and children he moved into the little town of Dumfries, and now he was separated from all that rustic country life and picturesque rural scenery that had been his inspiration. He turned down no more daisies in the field. The horned moon hung no longer in his window pane. He saw no more rosebuds in the morning dew, so pure among their leaves so green. Amid the dirty streets, the gossip and dissipation of a third-rate Scottish town, he was neither in harmony with himself nor with the world. And so, at the age of 31, worn out and old before his time, the greatest poet of Scotland died. Robert Burns' songs came to him as naturally as the carol to the blackbird. In one short summer's day he dashed off all of Tam O'Shanter. His songs are full of laughter, full of tears, and so immensely tender. In his heart was a great sympathy which reached out to all mankind, and to beasts and flowers of the field as well. He makes us smell the new-turned earth, the breath of kine, and the milk-white thorn that scents the evening gale. And yet his deepest interest was in men and women, lads and lassies. First and foremost he was the poet of the fireside and the hearth, of the wee white cottage glinting through the trees, with smoke slow curling from its peaceful ingle-nook, where wait some thrifty wife and wee sweet bairns to welcome home their dad. His touch falls on men's souls like the touch of tender hands, and of all great men from the North Country there is none who holds in his countrymen's hearts a place like Robert Burns. Important works: Tam O'Shanter, To a Mountain Daisy, The Coulters' Saturday Night, For All That and All That. End of section 8.